Hello. Today's activist tool is the blog, but really I wanted to talk about war and daily life. So often when we think about something like war, we're really entrenched in these masculine narratives that come to us from the newspapers, from the epic history dramas that we watch, from the history books that we read, and we forget what happens to women in those situations and what women's daily lives look like in war. Um, we again hear and read a lot about the soldiers, but we don't always think as much about who's affected on the ground, what the civilian costs are, how this affects women's abilities to take care of their children. And so that's really what we're talking about today, because a blog is really a tool to tell a personal story that you may not otherwise get, and personal unauthorized story that you might not otherwise get. I wanted to start off as your introduction to reading Baghdad Burning with some background on the Iraq War that some of you may or may not know. So 1980 to 1988 is the Iraq-Iran War, when neighboring countries Iraq and Iran are fighting each other. The US at that time actually provided arms and monetary support for Saddam Hussein's regime in fighting Iran. They eventually came to peace, but over the course of that 8-year war, there were 1 million deaths on both sides. And when we say that, that figure is direct deaths, meaning people who die directly as a result of the violence of war. It does not include people who lose their lives because the health system is now degraded, because of poor infrastructure, because of the rise in child mortality. And those figures are much harder for us to really have an idea of or to calculate. So that's sort of the first thing that happens in this country. Then in 1991, Iraq invades Kuwait, and the US in turn invades Iraq. For those of you who were not alive at the time, President George Bush Sr. is the president who's directing this one. The war is over very quickly, but from 1992 to 2003, Iraq faces continued economic sanctions that are very detrimental to the country's ability to grow its economy, rebuild its infrastructure, healthcare system, and all of the things that, as we've discussed, or as the Burn book discussed, really, I should say, have this disproportionate effect on women. And then from 2001, right after 9/11 to 2003, the Bush administration starts to build its case that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction, and in 2003, the US invades Iraq. Weapons of mass destruction are never found. Now, this whole weapons of mass destruction argument was something that was put out in the press quite a bit and became part of the mainstream narrative. They were getting the information from the government, who thought this information was good, or at least was telling people that this information was good. And it gives you kind of an idea of what some of the limitations are of the information that we receive, particularly when it's bound to the mercy of the government or to corporations. Now, according to Brown School of International Relations, that keeps really good data on the war, and also has similar data on Afghanistan and Pakistan if you're interested. So I really recommend you following up on this resource, watson.brown.edu, Costs of War. The Iraq War alone cost $2.2 trillion, 165 civilian direct deaths, and produced 1.9 million refugees, which is a huge number of people to be displaced. Now, when I say refugee, there are two terms that you'll hear. One is refugee, one is internally displaced persons. An internally displaced person is someone who's lost their home but still remains in the geographical borders of their country, and a refugee is someone who has crossed borders. And it's the distinction is probably not as relevant if you're talking about how many people have just lost their homes and been displaced. But if you're talking about where other countries need to come and step up to the battle, step up to the plate and provide services, then the figure of who is a refugee versus an internally displaced person is very important. And like I said, this is sort of the broad strokes of the narrative that you might get from the mainstream press. Now, when I think about, CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New York Times, Denver Post, any of those guys, they're always owned by large media corporations. It's never the case that an author or reporter can write whatever they want and whatever they feel like. There are always gatekeepers and editors who, at the very least, determine who works for the paper and who doesn't, and have a lot of control over the content as well. There are government regulations, even though we say we have freedom of the press. There are a lot of ways that that the government can get involved, in the very least, because the press really depends on the government for information. And lastly, there's some of the limitations of corporate ownership. So if you're owned by a corporate conglomerate that has ties to anyone who's going to benefit from the war, you may not be as free to speak. So when we talk about a blog, it's important not just because of its storytelling capability, which certainly is, but it's also really important because it takes you out of those structures. There's really no one approving these narratives at all. And, some people would say, well, that's just irresponsible. You can write whatever you want. You can write whatever you want. It's true. But at the same time, a lot of times silencing people's voices when they're trying to tell their story is a form of power. So in the narrative that you're going to read for this week, Baghdad Burning, the story of one Iraqi girl, you're going to get a much different view, I think, of the Iraq War than the one that you've probably grown up with on television. Some of us have grown up with it. Some of us maybe remember the Vietnam era and are drawing parallels with that. But she really gives you a glimpse of daily life in Baghdad, and you find out the way that services are interrupted. You hear her story about losing her job, about how limited her movements are, about the absolute terrorization that her family feels from the occupying soldiers, and some really harsh criticisms of the U.S. government involvement in Iraq. She, unlike, I think, a journalist, doesn't have to be fair and balanced. She's simply telling her story. But one of the reasons that I assigned it is because I think that storytelling really can build empathy. And in doing that, start to build peace. And one of the pieces of war that we really don't think enough about are those everyday civilian costs. We may look at the death tolls and maybe even just think about the American soldiers who are killed, but we've completely destroyed a country's infrastructure in committing to war, and really set them back generations in terms of their social services, their population, and that country's ability to go back to normal. And so I wanted you to think about, as you go into the discussion boards this week, what difference does it make when you read about something in a textbook or hear about something from the mainstream press in this very academic way versus when you actually are able to hear stories from people who are living there on the ground, and really and even maybe start to get a really rich textual feel of what life is like for the women who are caught up in war. And in the last part of Baghdad Burning, her very last article, she writes, "Don't worry, I'm safe for now in Syria." And that's obviously a little bit dated at this time. So I wanted to give you an idea of what the situation looks like for her in a Syrian refugee camp, likely. This is Zaatari refugee camp in Jordan, where if you had gone to Syria, you may now have ended up. So if you think about her life, I try to think about, or at least trace, what might have happened to her. And if you think about her life, if she was displaced into Syria, it's very likely that she would have ended up, again, a refugee in a camp like Zaatari. Zaatari refugee camp in Jordan. This picture is from fall 2013, when it was at its height population of 200,000. So that's the same size as Fort Collins, for those of you who want some basis of comparison. It's currently down to 79,000 people, which is still huge. And here are some of the pictures of what daily life looks like. And I want you to try to imagine being a parent in this situation, being a mother, being a child, being one of the people for whom this is now your daily life. So right here we have the school. Over here we have the supermarket. And over here we have the playground. And I think that, it is very powerful that we now are able to have these images, these unauthorized images, come through to us. I'm curious to see what you all will think about Baghdad burning. And I'm looking forward to hearing from you how that might inform your perspective on what we should do next as a country. Should we get involved in Syria? What are going to be the costs of that? And how might we as feminists start to think about war? Certainly we want to build peace. And when we look at what the costs are to women's everyday life, I think the argument gets much stronger. So please read Baghdad Burning with that in mind, and I'll see you on the discussion boards.